All right, what's up, Montreal? You guys are gonna have to do a little bit better than that. I'm gonna need some energy. It's raining, it's the last afternoon. I need a little bit more energy. What's up, Montreal? Thank you, thank you. So I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I'm born and raised in Brooklyn. Anyone been to Brooklyn? Any Brooklyn fans? And this is my second time in Montreal in like the last month. I was here for a week for this Next City Vanguard conference that Concordia put on. And every time that I'm here, it reminds me of what a special place that you all call home is. So just so I know, how many people here are from Montreal? Yeah, cool. And how many people live in Montreal? Sweet. All right, so home crowd. Down south, your southern neighbor, we're a little bit envious of the leadership that you all have here. And so I thought, as a tribute to what's happening in Canada, and also on the anniversary of Montreal, that I would represent with some sock diplomacy. I know it's a big thing for you all, but Space Invaders, any old school video game geeks, can we get a zoom in on this? I don't know if, is this gonna work? Space Invaders, anyone? Yeah? All right. Space Invaders is almost 40 years old. Anyway, I want to talk to you all not only about the future of cities, and we'll talk a little bit about the trends that we see happening and shaping the future of cities, but also where we are today and where cities have kind of come from. So maybe just before we get started, I'm going to ask you all to close your eyes. Just close your eyes for a second. And I want you to think about your favorite part of your city, right? It can be where you live now. It can be where you grew up, your favorite restaurant, a park, your block. Just get that picture in your mind, okay? And think about, what do you love about that place? Food, people, right? All the different things that you love about your city. And then I want you to think about all the things that you hate about that place. Traffic, construction, right? Maybe the cost, although maybe in Montreal cost is not such a big issue, but still, right? So all those different elements, you can open your eyes. This is kind of what we have to contend with cities, right? And the question really is, what's the city of the future going to look like? Is it going to look like this? How many people think that this is what the city of the future is going to look like? Wow. Really? Does anyone have any idea where this is? Hong Kong. I heard Hong Kong. Anyone else? Sao Paulo. Truth is, it could be anywhere, right? It could be anywhere. How many people want us to live in a city where this is a landmark, right? I don't think so. Like, there's no hands going up. And the reason is because no one wants to live here, but people do. And it's not just in the US, and it's not just in Canada, but truly, it's places all around the world. And so I think you have to ask yourself, if we don't want to live in places like this, why do we? Like, why would anyone actually want to live there? And in order to answer that question, I think you start with this. So this is Central Park. This really became a model for the grid-based approach to urban planning. And what you have here are 2,000 neatly divided parcels that you can plan around. And part of the reason why this inspired a number of grid-based cities really all around the world is because this allows you to simplify real estate transactions. 2,000 identical blocks, describe it in really easy language, neat price tag attached to those parcels. And the key thing is that all the blocks basically follow the same rules. And the neat thing is that if you understand one, you can understand them all, right? It's replicable and it's scalable, right? And so for you entrepreneurs, you know that scale and replicability when it comes to a business model is what you should be searching for. But this is how we design cities for a very, very long time. Now, the interesting thing is that really the same kind of holds true for our transportation infrastructure. If you understand the smallest entity, which is the car, then you can really understand the entire system. And you understand what it needs, right? The car needs wide roads, needs a lot of big parking lots. You can measure it, you can quantify it, and the thing is that if it doesn't work, then you can build more, right? Widen your highway, build more bridges, build more parking lots, etc. And the automobile has profoundly shaped our cities, right? Our cities look the way that they do today, largely because of this. And unfortunately, this has really created some of the most dystopic, awful, dysfunctional environments in human history. And you can look at some of that dysfunction and come to the conclusion that cities are a bad idea. And that the future of cities is not that, but it's much more spread out, and it's suburban, and it's planned, or it's rural. But that is not the conclusion that I will come to. Because I have memories like this. Anyone else grow up in a similar kind of environment where you had like these experiences, like playing out on the street? Yeah? Just show of hands, just so I know. Like, who's opened up a fire hydrant on a hot summer day? Yeah, cool. Okay, you are my people. I think actually that cities are a fantastic idea. I think they might be one of the best ideas that human beings have ever had. But the important point is you have to recognize that cities are meant to serve people. And actually the best cities are the ones that are designed for social cohesion, they're designed for strong neighborhoods, they're designed for creativity, spontaneity, right? Those kind of like chance environments that you cherish, and that mixed kind of experience that allows for openness, but also privacy. And I think actually that the only way that you get this, the only way that this happens, is if you follow the words of the legendary urbanist and author Jane Jacobs, who was really kind of a revolutionary at the time. And she said that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only when and only if they're actually created by everybody. And so what does this mean in an era of crowdfunding, in an era of participatory democracy, in an era of connectivity, when everyone is connected to each other, but also increasingly to government when they're responsive, to try to build cities that are really vibrant and creative and centers of this. And now there's a whole lot of talk about smart cities, right? So smart cities, like you can go to 50 different smart city conferences all over the world, and you can talk about all the different elements of the smart city. But ultimately, like, what does that mean? Like, how do you define what a smart city is, right? So there's a number of different elements to it, but I think it's livable, and I think it's lovable, and I think it's connected, and it's efficient. It has to be efficient, right? You have to be able to provide resources to people who need them. And it's not just one silo. It's not just the government's responsibility to build a smart city, right? I think that founders have a huge role to play in building these smart cities that are actually going to benefit people and to really become a draw. And by the way, so do large corporates. And large corporates see this opportunity. And actually, when you go to those smart cities conferences, the people who have the most visible presence there are the Fortune 500, right? They see it too. They see it too. But again, it's not just one piece. I think you really have to think about this thing holistically. And increasingly, where I see opportunities for founders is in the wrinkles between a lot of these different segments, between how we think about energy and the built environment and mobility and waste and water systems and more effective government, and so on and so forth. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, but this is a trend that is not going away. So believe it or not, North America is the most urbanized place in the world. So you hear predictions about population growth, but it turns out that 82% of North America is actually urbanized. That's where 82% of our population lives. And 2 years ago, humanity reached an interesting tipping point where, for the first time in human history, there was more people living in cities than living in the countryside. Just think about that for a second. More people living in cities than in the countryside for the first time ever. And again, you follow that trend, it's not going away, right? That challenge of how do you live more efficiently, more effectively, thinking about climate issues, energy issues, food security issues, like this is really hard stuff. So maybe I'm just going to pause here and tell you, like, I don't have all the answers. So in case anyone was thinking that my Future of Cities talk was going to be me giving you all the answers, not going to happen. But what I want to try to do is to kind of be provocative and ask some of the questions, because I think that that's actually critical, is making sure that we're asking the right questions and then bringing like the really smart people to the table from different disciplines and kind of taking a new approach to solving some of those challenges, because they're absolutely critical challenges, and we cannot turn away from them if you want a good living experience in your city. So Varun from Qualcomm Ventures talked a little bit about this yesterday. Autonomous vehicles are coming, right? They're coming. And they might not come as quickly as some of our friends on Sand Hill Road would have you believe. But there's no doubt that there is a trajectory here, and that they're going to profoundly change the way that people get around. Now, this has some really interesting implications for the number of vehicles that will be in our cities. And it also has, obviously, ramifications for our workforce, our truck drivers and taxi drivers, and I know that's a really big issue here in Montreal. I just want to tell a very quick story. At the LA Auto Show last year, the CEO of Volvo and the mayor of LA, Eric Garcetti, got into a shouting match. And the reason was because the CEO of Volvo was upset that the lines weren't painted properly on the roads around the auto show. And the mayor said, well, look, your cars have to recognize the lines as they are. And we'll talk a little bit more about infrastructure investment later, but if you drill down and think about all the things that have to go right in order to see the proliferation of autonomous, it's like very little things, like making sure that the lines are well defined and that the car can actually read those lines. So there's a lot of tension here, and this is not just going to be a straight line, right? This is going to be a very bumpy road. The other hockey curve, like that reference to the hockey? Okay, thank you. Is around EVs. So Bloomberg New Energy Finance just came out, I think this was just 2 weeks ago, with a really interesting study. And what they claim is that basically in the next decade, you're going to see EVs that are going to be cost competitive, essentially, with traditional cars. That's a really big deal. Like, this is a really big deal because the cost of storage is dropping a whole lot faster than what people thought would happen. And ultimately what that means is that you're going to have options, if in fact you're looking at a vehicle, to go with a traditional internal combustion engine or with an EV, but not the total cost of ownership over the lifetime, but your actual upfront cost may be at parity with your traditional car. And that's a game changer for a number of reasons. And you think if you look kind of down the stack and up the stack about what that means and what we need to do to get ready for that, because we've had basically 100 years of building out our gas infrastructure for our cars, but not the same amount of time, obviously, for EV infrastructure. But we will have to get ready, and I think there's a really, really big opportunity there. In fact, some of that stuff is already happening, right? And I don't know what this looks like in Montreal, but charging infrastructure is a huge opportunity. And the question really becomes, how do you integrate it so that it's not like an ugly gas station? Like, no one ever sees a gas station and says, oh, look, let's go to the beautiful gas station, right? Look at that well-designed gas station. That doesn't happen. The question is, how do you integrate charging so that maybe you do have a different experience with it? Maybe it's beautiful, right? Maybe there's a different kind of experience, and there's some emotionality that's involved in getting a charge, right? The really difficult thing here is for city leaders. And do we have anyone from the city here? Like, is there? Okay, cool, great. A couple of people from the city. So there was a really great report that came out a couple of months ago from a traffic management shop and an economic development consulting firm, where there were 6 key recommendations for city leaders. Because again, this change is coming, and the challenge is that if a mayor has a 4-year term, or if they're lucky they serve for 8 years, how do they plan for something that might not be here for 20 or 30, right? But there's a couple of really interesting points, some that I think are likely self-evident. Let's see if I can get this thing to work, right? So we'll talk about this, right? And obviously there's that. But the prioritize and modernize public transit one is, at least it seemed to me, somewhat counterintuitive. Why would you invest in mass transit if you think that there's going to be a flood of new autonomous vehicles coming? And the reason is because you need mass transit to move the amount of people that we have. That if we have single-occupant vehicles that are autonomous, that ultimately it makes the traffic problem a whole lot worse. And actually, I think increasingly people want multi-modal options to get around their city, right? So again, just show of hands, like who takes the train on a regular basis? Train or bus? Okay. Who takes the Bixi bike share on a regular basis? Right? Not that many of you. And who takes Uber or Tio taxi or another taxi on a regular basis? Right. So increasingly, the way to kind of think about this is that it's not one option. There are multiple options at play here. I just wanted to highlight one of the really interesting trends that I like to think about, which is the massive amount of parking space and parking garages that we have. Now, I don't know the stat for Canada, but in the US, we actually have almost twice as many parking spots as we have people. Yeah, we have like 350 million people and more than 500 million parking spots. And in fact, there's a firm called Arrow Street, which specializes in zoning and urban planning, and they estimate that if you see this continuous adoption of things like Zipcar, Lyft, Uber, etc., and autonomous, that by 2035 in the US, that the demand for parking would decline by 5.7 billion square meters. And that's a lot, like that's a really big number, so I did the math. That's like the entire landmass of the city of Montreal times 13. That's like 13 cities just of parking that will disappear. So again, question becomes, what do we do with that space? And that's why I say, like, there's an awesome opportunity for you entrepreneurs, but also for you policy people. You have to start thinking about this stuff, right? Because the last thing that you want is empty space, right? No one wants that within a city. But the question is, can you begin to zone things now and plan for them so that you don't build a parking lot with inclined lots, but so that you're actually building things that can be retrofit in the future for retail or restaurants or what have you, right? That kind of thinking. Because again, you build a structure like this, it's going to last at least 20 years, probably more like 40, 50. So thinking about how do you plan for the adaptive reuse of things like parking. And again, this is a massive opportunity. This is not science fiction, by the way. It's already starting to happen in places like Los Angeles, Miami, Massachusetts. There are states and developers who are thinking about this and actually building out some of these structures today, because what they're starting to see, and there's a great story about the Grove in LA, which is like it's like the biggest mall in LA. And they've had to establish a zone for rideshare, and just people are not coming and getting their car parked for the day. They're using Uber or Lyft or what have you, and getting dropped off and picked up. So you have to be smart and kind of think about that. One of the interesting potential opportunities, aside from things like parks or retail or hotels or what have you for parking, could be food. This notion of distributed food is also fascinating. And again, this is not science fiction, but this is stuff that's happening today. And this is where there are entrepreneurs like Farm Shelf and others who are thinking about how do we grow food in entirely new ways. And where this becomes really, really interesting is doing it in places where citizens don't have access to fresh food. So these are places that we call food deserts, and they proliferate in urban America. But it's not just America. They also actually proliferate in places like Notre Dame de Grasse, and places in Montreal, right? And places really all around the world. So I think this is a really big opportunity. That being said, I also, I still think that there's a good chance that some of us will still want the experience of getting in a car and driving. Now, I'm not saying like in rush hour traffic in Montreal at 6 p.m., but I'm saying on the weekend, you're with your family, what have you, like having that opportunity and the control of driving is a human emotion that I'm not sure will readily give up anytime soon. And so then the question becomes, if we don't, can you make sure that the experience that you get in your car isn't completely different from an experience that you have in your house or in your business, right? And particularly if you're going to be stuck in traffic and you have the time to be productive, right? Making sure that your interfaces, your contacts, your preferences on your temperature, kind of music that you want to listen to, etc. All of that stuff is coordinated and kind of linked. And I really do think that there's a massive opportunity around the personalization of vehicles, particularly for rideshare, particularly if you don't own the vehicle. Having that same kind of experience when you get into a new vehicle, that personalization is a really significant opportunity, and it's something that the auto OEMs, including many, are working on. I wanted to talk a little bit about the choices that we make when we decide kind of how to go from point A to point B. So given the proliferation of options, what are you going to choose? And what do you use to make those choices? So the idea of data and data visualization and really finding kind of the right times to display that information is tough. It's really challenging not only to work with large transportation agencies, but also to get that real-time information from multiple sources. And again, there are startups, folks like Transit Screen, who are tackling this opportunity and finding kind of the right transactive moments where they can deliver this in entirely new formats and in entirely new ways so that these decisions become actionable. I think there's an opportunity here to throw in some dynamic pricing so that it's not necessarily always the cheapest option, but that behavior is manipulated in a way around a reward system so that peak can be shifted. And you start to see this in places like Singapore, where if you ride the subway there before 7, it's actually free. And as you take it later during kind of rush hour, it gets more and more expensive, right? So it's those slight nudges and using pricing to do that I think becomes interesting. The other element of dynamic pricing, which is neat, is something called UBI. And the insurance industry is changing in a way where drivers can now demonstrate their safe driving skills, and rather than pay a premium for the entire year, they can actually pay a much lower premium in return for monitoring of their car. Now, I know that there are some privacy issues around this, but what winds up happening is you actually have a more transparent market because insurance companies are able to price their premiums more accurately when they have personalized driving data about the people who are driving, and you as the driver essentially get a tailored rate that's more based on kind of your driving habits as opposed to existing statistics about demographics. This is, I think, not only an opportunity where you're going to start to see dynamic pricing for insurance, but also for the way that we price our roads. Because right now, in Canada, you get about $8 billion a year in gas taxes. And that $8 billion a year is used for things like road repair and infrastructure. And if we have this massive shift towards electric vehicles and people aren't paying at the pump, then the real question becomes, do you think about paying per mile? Or is there some other element by which roads are priced? And that could be based on different times, different locations, different usage patterns, completely altogether. Okay, so now we're going to shift from kind of the road to the grid. But I will say that I think actually that some of the same principles apply. And the notion here is that you're going to have a decentralized system with a more transactive element on it and pricing that is really based on actual usage. This is starting to happen in places like New York, where there's a startup called Brooklyn Microgrid, which is really trying to create a peer-to-peer energy exchange. And they're using blockchain to manage the ledger and trade energy amongst different neighborhood participants. And even though New York is not the sunniest place, the amount of solar that has been installed there has increased by like 300% over the last 4 years. So people will do the right thing for the wrong reason, but when you combine things like blockchain and the ability to be financially compensated for producing distributed energy on your roof, and that output is valued differently depending, again, on where it is on the system and when it is on the system, things get really, really interesting, and they change very, very dramatically from how they used to be. So I'm going to talk about that in a second, but I want to say, like, the reason why we're doing this and the reason why you're starting to see these shifts towards things like distributed energy is because we have some significant emissions reductions goals, right? So while nationally we might not want to acknowledge that, at the state level, like, this is where the action is happening. And so you all should know that within New York, there are some really significant goals around emissions reductions. And these are actually the same goals that the state of California has. And the question really is, how do you get there in a way that doesn't bankrupt the utility? Because no one wants a bankrupt utility. I know a lot of people probably hate their local utility, but actually, like, you need the grid. So it's not that the panels on your roof are going to produce 100% of your energy. And God forbid, if you're in a hospital, you don't want to be completely reliant on things like distributed generation, or if you run a big data center, like, that's not going to happen. So there's a real kind of hybrid approach. And what that necessitates is business model innovation. So I'm just going to play you a very quick video that talks about the kind of business model innovation, the kinds of experiments and hypotheses that are being tested now to figure out this path forward in New York. So if you can play that video, that would be great.
Thomas Edison built the world's first commercial electric grid in New York City back in 1882. Since then, energy providers have produced electricity in large power plants, and utilities have transported it safely and securely to customers. This system has served us well for over a century, but not without issues. The system is too dirty. There's too much energy wasted. When extreme weather strikes, breakdowns can leave you without power when you need it most. And our bills are too high. We need to do better. Today, there is an unprecedented clean energy opportunity, and New York State's Reforming the Energy Vision, REV, is designed to realize it for all New Yorkers. We're retrofitting buildings to make them more efficient, installing solar panels on schools, building local wind farms, and community microgrids. These solutions are already saving money on electric bills, creating jobs, keeping the power on, and protecting the environment for generations to come. But to fully realize this clean energy opportunity, we need to create new models of engagement. Introducing REV demonstration projects. They bring together innovators from the technology world, businesses, and utilities to develop new business models for the energy system of tomorrow. In New York, instead of fighting change, we're embracing it to create flexibility, efficiency, and competitive markets so we can realize the full potential of clean energy. REV demonstration projects are one of over 40 REV initiatives we're launching to bring clean, affordable, and resilient energy to your home and community. With the energy to lead, New York is the state of opportunity.
All right, cool. Obligatory New York promo there. Just want to talk about infrastructure because a lot of that stuff doesn't require necessarily new technology. What it requires is investment, right? Dollars. And this is a really scary image from Minnesota. This happened about 10 years ago. 13 people were killed when the I-35W bridge collapsed. The scary thing is that this will likely happen again. And the reason is because we have a real challenge with investing in infrastructure. You can see the stats. You look at what's needed just in our wastewater infrastructure alone. It is absolutely staggering. And yes, things are better in Canada. But actually, when you look at this similar report card from the Canadian Society of Civil Engineers, you also have a massive need for infrastructure investment. Your bridges, your roads, your water infrastructure, your electrical grid. The question, again, is not only a question about technology innovation, there's a real question around business model innovation and leadership. And I think that, again, this is really where there is the need for new thinking. And I think entrepreneurs are some of the best sources of that new thinking. I think it probably also requires a little bit of luck. So I had to bring luck into the conversation because otherwise Alistair would kill me. And I just want to say, like, sometimes hard work and talent and skill and technology are not enough. So I found this quote from E.B. White. Did anyone ever read Charlotte's Web or Stuart Little? Yeah, so E.B. White's a great author, right? And he said luck is not something that you can mention in the presence of self-made men. While I think that's probably true, I think that when we're lucky, we're more likely to plow some of our own good fortune into the common good. And so if, in fact, you find yourself in that position, I think there's a real good opportunity here to think about how we can begin to solve some of these problems. So how do we get there? Well, number one, we have this trend working in our favor. There will be more than 1 trillion connected devices by 2020, according to some estimates, right? And the price of sensors and things like Raspberry Pis continues to drop. And this is really good news if you're thinking about infrastructure, investments, communications, things of that nature. The way that we think about cities is changing. So it used to be very siloed, right? We used to think about, you had the stuff, the unseen, unsexy stuff, your wastewater infrastructure stuff. And then you had the buildings and roads, et cetera, that were connected to it. And then you had the people. And I do think that there is a new paradigm that is emerging where citizens are a whole lot more engaged in the decisions that are being made within their cities. And that's hopeful, right? That should fill you with some hope. And technology has a key role to play here. At the same time, I think accessibility is key. And it's not just physical accessibility, it's also digital accessibility. So in New York City, believe it or not, 1 in 5 New Yorkers still don't have access to the internet, which is crazy. Broadband internet is like oxygen, right? And ubiquitous high-speed broadband is probably the best leveler from an economic perspective. And as we deliver new services, we think about kind of the digital divide and what that's going to mean from a transportation and mobility perspective. I think we have to keep in mind the idea here that accessibility is probably not only a moral imperative, but also it is a massive opportunity from an entrepreneurial perspective. Again, I think it happens too infrequently that startups and policymakers and corporates and other leaders of cities are in the same room talking about the same things and building relationships with one another. And so at UrbanX, what we really try to do is to build an environment where that kind of exchange and dialogue can happen in a really candid way, and it can happen in a way that's outcome-oriented before things are built. So where there's a lot more traditional customer discovery and customer development for companies not only who are selling to government, but who are selling to real estate, transportation, OEMs, et cetera. I want to just briefly note that the notion of design, I think, is too rarely emphasized in the way that we interact with our cities. And design and engineering can really bring emotional experiences to things that we wouldn't necessarily think should have those kinds of experiences built in. And at Mini, which is a company that was created by a refugee from war during a time of the first gasoline crisis in London in the 1950s, this is really kind of within the DNA of the company, is to use design as a tool to completely rethink the status quo and solve problems. And I think that's critical. So finding our sweet spot, right, where that sweet spot exists, that's the mission. That should be the journey, right? And for all of you who are excited about that opportunity and who think that not only is there money to be made and jobs to be created and better outcomes for our friends and family and kids and neighborhoods, I invite you to join me. It's my contact info. And I thank you for your time.